Good morning and good afternoon, everybody. This is Giulia Pierini, Senior Consultant in the Patient Engagement Department of Alira Health, and I will be the host and moderator of today's sessions on Patient Advisory Board in Clinical Research. I see that there are still people connecting, so I suggest let's wait 1 minute more, and then we start. Okay, I think we can start. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar about Patient Advisory Board in Clinical Research. I am Giulia Pierini. I am a Senior Consultant in the Patient Engagement Department of Alira Health, and I will be the host and the moderator of today's session. Before we go through it, let me just talk a little bit of a couple of items. As you can notice, you are all muted, but we highly encourage all of you to ask any question you may have in the toolbar. You can ask the question at any moment during the webinar. I will collect them and address them with our guests at the end of the session in the Q&A part. The webinar of today will be recorded, and after the call, you will receive an email with the link to the recording, so you can rewatch it after. And the last but not least, I would like to introduce the sponsor of the webinar, which is Alira Health. We are an international, patient-centric, and technology-enabled advisory firm, and our mission is to humanize healthcare. In order to do so, we have a full spectrum of services ranging from patient engagement, clinical research, clinical development, regulatory, market access, technology-based consulting, and real-world evidence, just to name a few. If you would like to know more about us, please visit the download section of this webinar. And in this very same section, you can also find the latest material from patient engagement, which is a literature review about the patient role within HTA agencies. The webinar of today, as advanced, will be about Patient Advisory Board as a tool to engage in early clinical research with patients. Among all the other topics, we will talk about what's the ideal time to set up a patient advisory board, for example, what are the best practices to manage and set up a patient advisory board, and also how to incorporate all the findings and all the insights that patients give us into clinical development. So without further ado, let me introduce you our guests of today. First of all, I would like to introduce to you Annabel de Maria. Annabel is the Vice President of the Patient Engagement Practice of Alira Health. She has spent all her career inserting and implementing the patient voice within the pharma industry, and she has been responsible of several patient-centric launches of blockbusters such as Viagra, Champix, Lucentis, just to name a few. She's also an active member of the Rare Disease Department of the Hospital Clinic of Barcelona. Welcome, Annabel. And
Thank
also
you,
today with us, today with us, there is Philippe Picaut. Philippe is the Chief Scientific Officer of AlgoTherapeutix. AlgoTherapeutix is a company that is aimed at finding novel solutions to treat complex pain. At the moment, they have a molecule called ATX-01 focused on treating locally the nerve damage of patients suffering CIPN, so chemotherapy-induced peripheral neuropathy. AlgoTherapeutix is a company extremely focused in including the patient perspective within their clinical research program in order to, let's say, enhance the outcome for patients. So welcome, Philippe, and thank you both for being here today.
Thank you, Giulia.
I see that most of the people are connected. So before starting with the discussion, I would like to launch a poll. And because I would like to hear from our audience first, and I would like to ask to our audience if you have ever organized or run a patient advisory board in clinical research. So you can click on yes if you have done already this, have you ever used this tool in clinical research, or not if you have never had the chance to, not to use a patient advisory board, but specifically in clinical research. I think it would be very interesting to hear from you. Just start from the beginning in order to tailor make the conversation today. We still have a few seconds. And I see that most of the people, so 73% of our audience today has never done, at least used a patient advisory board in clinical research, and 27% has it. So I think that this is a very interesting data. For whoever has already done this, use a patient advisory board in clinical research, feel free to insert your comments and your feedback and your experience in the toolbar. And for everyone that has never done it, I hope this will be a very insightful section for you. So I would say let's start with the conversation. And since the result of the poll, I would like to ask Philippe a very basic question, but very important to set up the foundation of the discussion. Philippe, why do you think we should include patients in clinical research?
So I think that, you know, we will all agree that there is an increased recognition that in incorporating patients and talking to patients as early as possible in our development process, we should improve patient recruitment, we could improve health outcomes, and at the end of the day, we could improve the results that we obtain from our clinical trials, which might be very much focused on the patients more than on any other process that we have used to so far when we develop our clinical development programs. And
Thank
of course,
you. And
what is also extremely important is to ensure that, you know, we don't only focus on the primary and secondary outcome measures, but also we try to improve or to see if we can improve the quality of life of the patients, which is of utmost importance here. In my field of expertise in pain, it's even more relevant, given that it is a very subjective symptom. And so talking to the patients, we learn much more than what we think we know at this stage of the game.
Absolutely. I think in your therapeutic area, no one better than the patient can really give you specific insights. And Annabel, what do you think? Why we should do so?
Yeah, I second everything that Philippe said. I would dare to say that regardless of the subjectivity of the therapeutic area, which is the case that we just spoken, patients remain key stakeholders to involve before planning the clinical development of a product. I mean, patients' insights implemented early enough in development can lead to trials based on more meaningful, not just endpoints, but also more feasible protocol for patients. We tend to forget about the logistics most of the times. We can even develop some clinical trials that are not feasible for patients in terms of logistics. Then, I mean, what does it all mean for sponsors? I mean, I guess that besides working towards a patient-centric needs, it allows to, as an example, faster recruitment, lower dropout rates, less protocol amendments, which indeed it completely impacts most of the time in the budgets of the clinical research. Therefore, there's a huge set of benefits for us to include the patient perspective in clinical development.
I totally agree. And Annabel, this is also true for rare diseases?
Oh, wow, this is particularly true for rare diseases. I mean, in this field, a continuous communication with patients is key, because the higher the unmet needs, the higher the involvement with patients, you could say. Rare disease patients often have to invent a journey for themselves, and as such, they are expert in terms of disease management, pathology, potential solutions, trials open or expected. I mean, not only you can learn a lot from them, but including their point of view to make the clinical program focus on their real life needs, I would say it's mandatory.
And I think if I can add to the point on that, I think it's even more relevant for rare diseases because in general, of course, you have few patients and you are not dealing with a homogeneous patient population. So you have to ensure, and you have to be sure 100% that you are going to address the needs they have, not the needs we have. So that's even more relevant for this patient population.
I believe, Giulia, that rare disease patients are the most empowered type of patients right now. And you can get really surprised of the amount of knowledge that they have when it comes to a clinical trial. But we can talk about this later if you want.
No, I totally agree, and definitely we can provide some example about it later on in the conversation. I would like to ask Philippe, regardless of the therapeutic area, when do you think it's the ideal moment to start engaging with patients in clinical research?
I think personally that we have to engage them as early as phase 2. We call it proof of concept, we call it regular phase 2, doesn't matter, or as early as phase 1 when we talk about oncology, for instance. But the sooner the better. We all know that we have to develop PROs. It is mandatory by regulators, and we have to be sure that if we enter into that, we have to validate the right PROs, because of course for some conditions the PROs are not validated. So if we enter into this a labor-intensive activity, we have to be sure that they are going to be addressing really the need of the patient. So I would suggest as early as phase 2.
Agree.
And why you were saying, sorry, Annabel, I have just a quick follow-up question for Philippe. Why you were saying phase 1 for oncology?
Yeah, because in oncology, we immediately recruit patients, right, with different type of cancers, depending on the way we want to design our trials. Mm-hmm. But that's why if we're in the oncology field, I think it is extremely important to really talk to the patients before we set up the first protocol, because the first protocol will give a tone for the rest of the program. So the earlier we know, the earlier we have the feedback from patients, I think, the better we're going to design our trials. And as Annabel said, sometimes it never happened to me, of course. You can design a trial which is not feasible, and we have to take that into consideration, because the operational aspects are as important as the scientific or medical aspects at the end of the day when we talk about clinical development.
Yeah. I mean, we've seen with all the good intentions from some PIs developing trial protocols in gene therapy, rare diseases, which are very complicated, and patients have to drive 400 kilometers to the trial center. And then we've seen 10 visits required for the first 2 months, which are, it was absolutely infeasible for some patients, right? So that's why the sooner the better for us to understand the insights. And also, I have to admit that even with some companies, we are now working in the preclinical phase. Also, once again, it happens maybe a little bit more in rare diseases, but the sooner the sponsors can have a clear understanding of the patient journey, then those aspects of the patient journey that are told to us by the patient, not from the literature, which is a very different thing, then we can insert those insights into the clinical development process. And that, I would say, it is also critical.
Yeah, that's definitely true. And Annabel, now that we have set up the basis of why we have to interact with patients, can you explain to us what is a patient advisory board and why it's an important tool to engage with patients in clinical?
So a patient advisory board is a panel of expert patients who are able to provide a set of invaluable first-hand insights to enrich the existing strategies and to ensure that those patients' insights are correctly addressed in the product planning process. So usually it is a meeting of 5 to 8 patients maximum. They can be either patients or patient representatives, exemplifying a specific disease. With the objective to solicit patient voices and perspective on a variety of areas within the whole product life cycle. It is such a transversal tool that it can be used, for example, you can co-develop a device. You can co-develop a digital therapeutic solution in collaboration with those patients. You can check the real life feasibility of the clinical protocol as we were talking about the logistics. You can also check the relevance of the endpoints of the trial or co-develop the TPP with patients. Why not? We have had this experience already. Or testing these undigestible informed consents that we tend to put in front of the patient. And I think that one of the most interesting areas for using a patient advisory board is testing the patient-reported outcomes comprehensibility. I guess that indeed in this specific area, Philippe has a lot of experience.
Yeah, Philippe, what do you think? Why it's important to set up a patient advisory board in early development?
I mean, if I can share with you, you know, our recent experience with the design of our phase 2 that we are launching, we had one opportunity with some patients from different countries to discuss the protocol. So we have really discussed all the different items, all the different outcome measures that we wanted to put in place, and you know, it went beyond our expectations, to be very transparent, because the patients really shared their disease. They didn't share only their pain. They didn't share only one part of their disease. They share really how it impacts their life. And you know, it's always extremely important for all of us to don't remember that the patients don't see his disease the way we see the disease, or he doesn't necessarily see the disease the way it is described in our medical books. So that's why it is so important to have this dialogue. And on some aspects, it has been really eye-opening for us, leading to some changes, and even considering that you know, during the course of a trial, we'll have to help more of the patients to adhere to our protocol.
Yeah, and it's interesting because my next question would have been, can you provide us an example of when you have used a patient advisory board in clinical? But I think you have already answered this question, so yeah, I will pass it to
provide
Annabel.
another one. Yeah, that was a very good one, Philippe. We recently worked on Duchenne muscular disease. This is a rare disease affecting muscular development in children. And I was really shocked by the amount of knowledge that caregivers had about the clinical development. I mean, they not only knew exactly what trial their kid was on, but they know where they were conducted, the inclusion criteria. They had great information about what was coming next, and an exceptional clarity on what they wanted to join, which is another interesting point. What we could notice in that specific area is that caregivers were trying to access the type of clinical trial that was on the market that they believed it was better for their kid. That was really surprising for us. I mean, that once again, it shows us that in rare disease, sometimes the limited number of patients, as you mentioned at the beginning, the prevalence is low, and therefore sometimes that put different trials in competition already. And therefore knowing what the patients want, again, is the key, because they may even choose among different type of trials. That was really, for me, that was really an insight.
Again, extremely important, and especially in rare disease. So before we move on, I would like to launch a second poll, because I would like to hear from our audience. You can take as a reference what we have said so far about patient advisory board. What do you think could be the most challenging ingredient in setting up a patient advisory board? So we have some options here in the poll. For example, recruiting the right patient, could it be the most difficult thing to achieve? Managing the discussion effectively. Or, for example, if discussing sensitive topics such as adverse events, it could be the most challenging thing about this tool. For example, obtaining cross-functional insights, meaning being able to merge insights from clinical and regulatory, for example, or integrating the feedback of the patients within the clinical protocol. So what do you think are the most, or is, I would say, the most challenging ingredient? I have to say it's a tough one. I would myself having an hard time to choose across some of those. Let's see. So looks like we have a mixed opinion. Yeah, so most of the people said that 65% of our audience thinks that integrating the feedback into the clinical protocol would be the most challenging topic. And we will talk about this with Philippe in a minute, so thank you all. Finally, recruiting the right participants, managing the discussion effectively, and obtaining cross-functional insights. they were also mentioned, although not as in the majority of the case as integrating the feedback of patients. This is very interesting, and I think we can tackle actually most of this point also in our discussion. Philippe, for example, what do you think about the results of the poll, and what do you think for you it's the most challenging ingredient of a patient advisory board?
I'm not necessarily surprised by the outcomes of the poll, because integrating the feedback is always extremely difficult, and we can fear it, to be very honest, because usually we have worked for weeks or not even months on a study protocol with medical doctors, and also sometimes we have discussed that with regulators. We might have gone to the FDA, we gave a feedback, they want certain outcome measures and study design and statistics, so on and so forth. So we all know how it goes, and then we have this patient advisory board, and then we are going to discuss it again, right? I think the way I see it is different, is that it's a good opportunity, and it's really a gift that the patients are really giving to us, right? So we are going to discuss it. I mean, our experience is that we discuss it, and at the end of the day, we decide. But at least we are informed. So we cannot say we didn't know. And that's the most important from my perspective, is that we have to integrate that, or we decided on some to not integrate the feedback, but we know. So if it comes, and if it is an issue at the end of the day into our protocol, in our clinical study, we know, we were informed, we have decided, and we have to take decisions. So I think, we have to be open-minded, and at the end of the day, we have to recruit patients, right? We all know that clinical studies rarely go as we think, and so the more we inform, the better we decide. And the better we decide, maybe the better we're going to conduct our clinical trial, and the better we're going to conclude the program. And the earlier the product is going to be on the market. So that's all what we want, because at the end of the day, when we have a clinical trial which has a delay of 6 months or a year because of inclusion exclusion criteria which are not appropriate, I mean, the product is not going to be available for patients. So it's a lack of chance for patients. So that's the way I see it. But it took some time to see it that way, to be honest with you. And I have to admit that, in my first advisory boards in the past, I was also fearing to hear what the patients had to say, and really put upside down the study protocol.
That sounds like music to my ears, Giulia.
Sorry, can I just add something before passing the ball to Annabel? I remember, Philippe, once you told me that another difficult thing about patient advisory board is being unbiased from the sponsor perspective.
Right, and it is true that when we started to talk about that in the different companies where I work in, we had an organization called Patient Centricity, Patient Safety, and so on and so forth. And we were really asking ourselves, should we do it ourselves? Because, why not? Why not the pharma to do it themselves? At the end of the day, I think it's good to rely on people who are unbiased. Because it's very easy to bias outcomes, right? We all know that. And this is the last thing that we want, right? Because we want to hear the truth. Afterwards, as I said, at the end of the day, we're going to be deciding, we are informed, and we do the study protocol that we think has to be put in place, integrating the constraints that we have coming from the regulators, from the HCPs, and from the patients. And not forgetting that at the end of the day, what we want to do is to put product on the market, but we have a product to be approved. So we cannot put upside down our protocol because there are some constraints. But again, this is the most important, is to open our ears and then take informed decision on the way we are going to design our trial, and we are going to operationalize the study.
Thank you, Philippe. Very, very inspiring.
Very. I love it. Indeed. What it inspired me also is I was not planning to say this today, but really most of the companies dedicated to healthcare, we all tend to say that we are very patient-centric. I mean, we have to walk the talk. If we say it, we have to do it. So I think that we have to obligation to speak to patients even during the clinical trial. Otherwise, we sound a little bit patronizing. I mean, I have even heard comments about the patients are not prepared or they don't know enough about clinical. That's fine. We prepare those patients for the conversation, and you would be so surprised of how much aware they are, and especially how much aware they are about their disease, right? So I think it's worth a try. As Philippe just said, the only thing it can happen, worst case scenario, you can decide not to use that feedback, right? But it's very good that you know it and that you're aware of it. However, back to the question, Giulia, because I know that there were also some concerns about recruitment, right? And the moderation or the preparation of the patient, if I remember well. And my point is about recruitment. I think that it is very important for the patient advisory board that you find the right patients pool in terms of similarity of profile with your expected trial. Therefore, it's important to set up some criteria together with the sponsor of the trial of the type of patients that you're looking for. And then from there, you may have more possible insights in one meeting, right? So this is key. So this relies on connecting with the right patients for your board, and the clearest way to approach the selection process is what I just said, not just inclusion criteria, but also exclusion criteria. And therefore, that to me, it makes me feel that the recruitment process is key. I would like to warn you that this may take some time for you to secure the right profile of patient who can meet the expectations of the advisory board. And by some time, it depends. We may discuss about this, but 2 to 3 months. Sometimes you just recruit them in 1 month, but 2 months it would be a reasonable time for you to find them. And then there is another point that I would like to talk about, the specific of the recruitment. It is where do you find those patients? So recruitment is a difficult thing because ideally you should have a right balance between recruiting through patient organizations and also recruiting patients through the physician. Because if you just recruit patients from one of the sides, you may have the same type of patients, right? Sometimes patients coming from a patient organization, they are very empowered, they know a lot, and they might focus the conversation more on their interests. So having a variety of different profiles, that can help you a lot. And I think both type of sources are very interesting. On top, I would say that every patient advisory board needs a discussion or a moderator guide, let me say, but a key tool that outlines the structure of the meeting. You don't dare to start the conversation with patients without a very clear moderation guide, because when you start the conversation with a patient, it can never end, because they have so much experiences to share with you that you need to guide them in the right direction. So these effective guides can help facilitate a balanced meeting and also allow you to leave enough time for them to express themselves well, because time is equally important aspect of a patient advisory board. You want to allow all the time for them to express, but also you want to ensure that the meeting finishes at the right time without rushing. And usually these meetings tend to have a length of 3 hours, more or less. So that was my take on the recruitment and the moderation guide. I think those were the 3 most important topics, right? And Philippe already spoke about inserting the feedback.
Yeah, and if I can add the point, I think it's also very interesting to, like you were saying, guide the conversation while leaving some time to the patients to speak their mind, because on top of being so knowledgeable about their disease, a room or a virtual room of patients can trigger conversation and brainstorming sections among, let's say, each other that almost always lead to actionable points. So I agree with you. That's key. Annabel, remaining on the practical organization of a pub, can you explain to us what does it take from a practical perspective to organize a perfect pub? We have already discussed it a little bit about it, but also if you can add, what do you think are the aspects of a patient advisory board? Sorry, PAB, I mean patient advisory board. It's an internal acronym. What are the aspects of a patient advisory board that are always or often underestimated by sponsors?
Yeah, that's an interesting one, because for me, from a practical perspective, if you're going to organize the perfect pack, and now I am talking from the let me say, the provider of services in this case, right? So for us at Alira Health, the most important thing is it requires a great alignment with the sponsor in terms of the final goal, because everything starts from there. You may not have a set of 10 different goals for a patient advisory board, right? So you can clearly need to understand from, after a very good protocol reading and understanding, you together with the sponsor, you go through those topics that you believe are critical to discuss and those topics where you want to get feedback from. And at the end, you will need to collect all that data, and therefore you need to get an agreement from the beginning that you won't go beyond that, because first of all, patients need to be trained on the topic. They need to have a clear idea of what we are going to discuss, and you cannot move too much from that moderation guide, right? So for me, everything starts from a very effective recruitment and development of a good moderation guide, and then have a clarity on the objectives. And then to your point about the underestimated application of the tool, I think I have a clear vision on this one, and there might be, and also Philippe, he may have a different one. But I think that people tend to work in silos when it comes to a big organizations, healthcare organizations, other is if it's pharma or medtech or whatever type. And a patient advisory board is a tool that can leverage at 360, 100 degrees. I mean, this is a unique opportunity to discuss any aspect of a drug development or a medical device development with patients. Then therefore, a critical misstep of some sponsors is to think that a patient advisory board is in a silo, while patient engagement is a super cross-functional set of activities. I mean, in an example, a meeting organized for clinical purposes can absolutely be leveraged to also gain insights on market access. And I'll give you a classic example that we see very often, that people organizing something on clinical research who are about to discuss on an endpoint that is based on a patient-reported outcome. And in a big organization, there will be a market access team who can also give the feedback on whether that patient-reported outcome is going to be accepted in 5 or 7 years when you enter into the market, and you will be requesting for price and reimbursement of that drug. And there might be a disconnection between those areas. So if you're a big organization where you have the opportunity to have more members of other functions giving input into that specific item, I think it's critical. So this allows you to maximize the return of the investment, right? And to ensure that there is a patient-centric strategy that goes across the complete development cycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Annabel. Do you have any comment on that, Philippe, from your perspective, or? I don't know. I'm not.
Yeah.
It's okay.
Okay. Yeah, perfect. Let's move then to we still have time for a couple of questions. So I would like to ask Philippe, if in your professional career, in your experience, you have ever found yourself in the situation where you had a professional drawback, an issue, and you realized that this situation could have been avoided just asking to patients, just engaging with patients in early development.
So I'm going to give you a positive example of
Okay.
you know, what I've been doing. Some years ago, we were developing a program in another company with botulinum toxin in kids with cerebral palsy, and you know, we had the objective to run a worldwide clinical studies from Latin America to Russia, and we discussed a lot with HCPs. And I remember a trip in Mexico. We're in Mexico in a Teleton hospital, a large hospital with very nice people, and they were patients with parents, of course. And you know, we were talking about their treatment with botulinum toxin and so on and so forth. And when you treat kids with botulinum toxin, you want to associate that to a rehab program. And we realized that in some countries, they don't have any rehab program. So it doesn't make sense for us to conduct a clinical study while, you know, there is no rehab program. So what we did, and thanks God we did it, you know, quickly, we decided to develop our own rehab program for the purpose of this clinical study with the help of PTs. And we even, gave it to the parents to do it themselves at home with the
Okay.
kids, and we even publish it and put it at the disposal of anybody who want to rehabilitate kids who have this terrible disease. So without talking to them, we will have realized probably in putting in place right at the beginning of our clinical trials that it was not working the same in Western Europe versus Latin America, for instance. So that's an example that I have in mind because it was, it was really striking, and thanks God we talked to the patients and PTs and the healthcare professionals before to put in place a trial.
Yeah, you touch on a very important point. Also, geographical differences. It's something that when you talk to patients from different parts of the world, you mentioned, Annabel, the project we did in Duchenne muscular disease. That was a worldwide project. And the differences between South America, North America, Canada, China, Europe were huge. So that's a very good example. Thank you, Philippe. Annabel, do you have an example on top of your mind as well?
I think that unfortunately, I have quite a few examples of timings where we entered into the market and we failed because we didn't do a proper exercise during the clinical development. I remember some years ago, we launched a drug for spasticity in multiple sclerosis. So as you can imagine, and the format of the device was like an inhalator, very similar than an inhalator. So as a good patronizing, let me say, pharmaceutical company at that time, we put a nurse during the trial who was the one doing the path of the molecule, let me say. And so what happened that the path had to land inside in the interior of the mucosa of the cheek, right? So this, when it's done by a nurse, for sure that was working very well. And then results of the clinical trial were fantastic. Everything went very well, but then we entered into real life. And after some time, we started to realize that adherence started to go down, efficacy for sure. And we completely lost the credibility in front of some neurologists. They stopped prescribing our drug. And we had to just go back to the very beginning. And we decided to do what is the so-called ethnographic study. Some of our listeners today, they might not be very aware about it, but an ethnographic study is when you do a kind of market research with patients where you live with the patient. And so we decided to live with them in order to understand what was happening. And it was as easy as understanding that those patients had rigidity on the hands, and therefore when they were doing the path, the molecule was landing on the teeth most of the time, and there was no absorption. It was not a problem of the drug. It was a problem that we never took into account the real life of these patients. How would it look like, right? And so we had to first live with them, understand the problem, then go into a patient advisory board, co-create a new device together with the patient. So we put together patients and engineers on the table for them to co-create. But as you can imagine, we lost 3 years of sales. We had to resubmit the device in front of the FDA and in front of the EMA. I mean, it sounds very obvious, but most of the times we do ridiculous mistakes just for not asking patients. I have some others, but I think that this one is quite relevant.
Quite powerful. And I think, honestly, it touches a very important point that today we are focused on engaging with patients in clinical research, but we don't have to forgive the long-term effect in some way of engaging with patients in early development. What we are learning from patients is not something that is just used in the clinical development. The journey of the patients is the base. You use it throughout the full development of the product and even after launch. So that was quite.
That's a very good point, Giulia. For those companies that they really believe that they are patient-centric, they can just not connect with patients once because I need your help on one specific topic. this is a whole journey together with patients, right? So if you're the company who are going to then go into the regulatory process, the HTA process, and the commercialization, you have to engage with them at each of these stages. And then you will understand, as an example, what are they going to explain in front of the FDA and in front of the EMA, because they are seated at the boards of those regulatory entities, right? And so they have an opinion and they have a vote. So you have to keep going on that conversation, and then it arrives the time when you're requesting for price and reimbursement, and the HTA agencies, they request their feedback for the positioning of the product. And finally, we've seen it many times that you get to the commercialization stage, you've done a good job maybe with engaging with patients, and then it arrives the time of entering into the market. And there is a whole new thing in there that you need to understand. What are the barriers that they are facing in the healthcare system? What are the gaps in the system that they have to overcome? How long it takes for them to get diagnosed? For some rare disease patients, it takes 10 years to get diagnosed. And they get completely lost in the system flow, getting referred from one point to the other without getting a diagnosis. So you may given for granted that you put a product in the market and patients will present themselves at the doctor's office, and that may not happen.
Thank you very much, Annabel. That was very impactful, and I think at the end of the day we can summarize in saying that talking to patients allow us to prepare the drug and then our launch based on real needs. And then at the end of the day, when you launch something based on real needs, of course you will have adherence, traction, and as a natural consequences. No, so I totally agree. Thank you very much. We have time for one last question, and I would like to go back to Philippe. I know we have already talked about this previously in the conversation, but I think it's a very important point, and I would like to leave our audience with this point. How to incorporate the insights that we got from patients into the clinical trial protocol and into the clinical trial development overall.
So, so I think regarding the protocol, when we get the feedback, right, we have to review our protocol and see if really we want to make any change, right? That's the most important. Sometimes, you know, feedback from the patient is great, but it's not possible to do it now, but at least maybe for the next phase. So we can phase also the outcomes and see when we are going to incorporate the outcomes into our clinical program. And what was your second question? It was
in general how to implement in the clinical protocol and the clinical trial, like you were saying,
especially patient recruitment. You know, when we assemble some patients to talk about our protocol, and in case you realize that none of them would be eligible for your protocol, you have to think twice about what we have done. And you know, at the end of the day, we know patient recruitment is extremely difficult. So listening also the patients to talk about their condition can help us, or can help the HCPs, or us to help the HCPs to also present, you know, the clinical trial, because the clinical trial is a clinical trial, but it's never the same, right? It's never the same for the patient, it's never the same for the HCP, it's never the same for the pharma. And there are ways to present clinical trials to patients, you know, for them to understand, but to come back to one of the comments, most of the patients understand extremely well their conditions, right? I don't remember any single patient who was not understanding his condition and it was not pertinent in the feedback. And you know, presenting clinical trials, you know, to convince patients to enter into research program is a big thing, right? So if we can also use the verbatim of the patients to be sure that you know, they are going to be convinced that is the thing they have to do, it's also important. So I think we gain a lot of, you know, input, insights in talking to the patients directly.
That's a good point, Giulia, that we didn't mention, but using plain language summary when talking to patients, when preparing your moderation guide, or when preparing specific materials for them during the clinical trial, that's critical. And most of us should be much more experts in plain language summary, which is even nowadays requested by the EMA as one of the ways for us to report the results of a clinical trial. So this is a good point, that the type of verbatim, it is very, very important.
Absolutely. Thank you very much both for the insightful discussion. maybe let's wrap up before the Q&A's question, just saying that while Philippe, you were talking, on top of my mind, I thought that sometimes there are things that may be a little harder to change on the spot, but if we think long term and we think about eventually have to resubmit a protocol because we are not achieving recruitment, we have to also think how much time we are, let me say, losing now versus the long-term development of the trial. So thank you both for the discussion. We do have a couple of questions from the audience, plus a couple more were sent to me privately. So let's try to address all of them. I will start from the first one. It's from a participant working in the US, and she was commenting that it seems that the value of including patient insights may be more accepted outside the US. So based on your experience, do you think that's true? Philippe, for example?
I mean, not from my experience.
No.
We even recruited or the organization we were working with recruited extremely easily patients in the United States versus Europe. So that's not my experience, but from my experience, it's sometimes more difficult to recruit patients for patient advisory board than it is in the United States.
I would here I would add something. We have clear guidance from the FDA of the need for engaging with patients during the clinical phases, and they are public. So that's why I would tend to say the EMA tends to mention it, but we don't have guidance yet from the EMA released about the type of patient engagement that you require during clinical. So this question, it's kind of interesting because I would tend to say the opposite. Even in some of your meetings with the FDA, you can explain to them that you've been engaging with patients as per a patient advisory board and the type of insights that you got for a conversation with the FDA, and that should be very welcome by the FDA because it's what they tend to express publicly. I'm not saying, sorry, that in Europe is not the case, but sorry, but I believe that it might even be better in the US.
Yeah, I totally agree. Thank you both. Annabel, maybe specifically for you, we did not mention a specific point about contracts for members of the pub. So how do we work regarding this point usually?
That's a very good question. So yes, you have to put a contract in place when you work with patients. You have to do it. You have to be very, let me say, acknowledge of the importance of being compliant. Because I have heard many times in some conversations with different professionals in the industry that we cannot work with patients. That is absolutely false. We work with patients in any area, but in a compliant way. So first, you have to put in place a specific contract. In our case, we do it on behalf of the sponsor, but if you're planning to run it yourself, there's many different type of contracts that you can use for you to secure that they keep confidentiality, that you express very well in the contract, the type of retribution or compensation that they will get, and the timings that you expect to work together with them, etc., etc. And that brings me to the second point, which is the compensation. I mean, patients are working with you around 4 hours for an advisory board, and also because they need to get prepared, and sometimes they have some pre-read materials for them to study. I mean, they have to be compensated for this job and in a fair manner. There is usually some public calculators for you to calculate the fair market value of how much do you have to pay to these patients. There is some exceptions in some markets, like is the case for France, where usually there is a tendency of not compensating this work just because of some specific local regulations. It doesn't mean that you cannot do it, but you have to declare it, and therefore sometimes you make it a little bit more complicated, the process. However, I just want to make everyone conscious that you have to compensate the patient a reasonable price per hour of the work. Sometimes the price is a little bit higher in the US than in Europe.
Does this help? We have to say that the price is quite very reasonable for the time they spend with us.
Absolutely.
You're right. Yeah,
absolutely.
I don't know if it's
not really a big challenge for course, even as a startup company, is not a big challenge. So.
I think that, to your point, Philippe, it might even worth if we give a kind of range for the people to understand that we are talking about something around $100 per hour in the US and something around 70 euros per hour in Europe, I mean, per average. So that's not expensive at all. But what I mean is that they deserve to be compensated because they are working, right, on a project with you.
And they take the time. I mean, the last patient advisory board that we did, the patients were talking to us while taking their chemo. I mean, it's not the chemo. Sorry, it's not that
wow, yeah,
standard.
that was insightful.
Let's move on a little bit with the questions, because I just want to be mindful of the time. So QLA, next question is about quality of life, very important for patient regulators, but not yet very valuable for HTA. Yes. What do you think about this? And what do you think
Philippe,
will happen next?
I don't know if Philippe wants to go first.
No, ladies first. Ladies first.
Okay. Well, then I have to say that I'm happy to see in the last times that local payers are putting more attention into the type of quality of life data that they are receiving. However, this data has to be very robust. So you cannot collect data without presenting an important sample size of patients responding to that data. I mean that if you're planning to collect real world data during the clinical trial referring to quality of life, it is very welcome by some payers, but payers as the GBA, for example, they are very, very strict at requesting a minimum of 70% of those patients having responded to the quality of life questionnaires. So I would tend to say that quality of life is more and more welcome, especially where in rare disease. Because sometimes in rare disease efficacy, it is not the type of endpoint that you may find in the trial. So that's why it has much more importance, the quality of life portion of it. Also in oncology, right, I guess, Philippe?
Yeah, but I think, in terms of quality of life, this science has to evolve as well. We had the habit to put some quality of life scale which are not appropriate for either the molecule or the patient population really we recruit in our study. Talking about the SF36 or this type of scales, with some molecules in some conditions you don't have a single chance to move the needle. So we have also to work on this type of scale. Some, thanks God, are very appropriate for what we do, but some are not appropriate. So
agree.
So I think, and from a payer perspective, they have to be more open-minded as well, I think, because it's hard when you arrive at the end of a program, you have an approval, you have shown that there is a strong medical benefit, and then you spend again a lot of time to discuss, how the product is going to be reimbursed, while during that time the patients still don't have access to the medicine. Yeah. So there is something in the healthcare system that we have to improve, I think.
Yeah, that's very frustrating.
Totally. Yeah. And let me add also quality of life acceptance varies also between US and Europe, so it's also geographic dependent a little bit.
Yeah, and from a regulator's perspective, they have also to start thinking about how we are going to incorporate those data into the label, because for pharma companies not investing so much money in quality of life scales, because you have to process a lot of data, and then at the end of the day, it does not head up into your label for some statistical methodology from time to time. I think we have to make it better in the system.
Yeah, absolutely. A question for Annabel: Can the same patients enroll in a clinical trial be also recruited for participating in a patient advisory board?
So I think that for us to respond this, there is something that is critical to say that we haven't said. Patient advisory boards usually are, when we run them, they are blinded for our sponsors. So a sponsor can attend blinded. They can hear because they learn a lot. We are fully connected during the ad board, but therefore the patient does never know who is the sponsor of that trial, and then it may happen that one of those patients then might be selected for that trial, but that has nothing to do with the patient advisory board. You see where I'm going? What you never do is that you never use, let me say, the opportunity that you know those patients for you to then invite them into the trial. That is not an option, right? But it may happen that some of those patients ended up into your trial because you have selected them because they were fitting very well the criteria of your trial. Did I explain it correctly?
Yeah.
We have to be extremely clear. It's not a tool for us to recruit patients into clinical trials.
Yeah.
Not
Agree.
Clear.
Completely.
Now another question for both of you. Philippe, if you would like to start. How is patient engagement on top of quality of life, so in general, patient engagement perceived by payers? Does it make an impact during benefit assessment?
I mean, if we consider that, you know, their feedback is going to be critical for our clinical study design, and so that we have appropriate PROs, for example, into our study protocol, then we're going to have stronger data. Then, you know, it should be more convincing because we have rationale and ways to talk with the people and say, you know, these PROs were developed in collaboration in a way with patients, so they are relevant for the disease. So we will be stronger than what we are sometimes with the PROs that we have to use because there is no other choice, right? So I think that's a way where we can also progress, is how can we develop PROs with patient advisory boards, and if they are really relevant for their condition, how come somebody outside of them could say it's not relevant? So I don't have a solution, but I think that's also an improvement, where, you know, an avenue for us to work on.
Indeed, it has happened to us that we were presenting dossiers to some payers who were not aware about the condition when it was a very difficult or ultra rare disease. So by explaining them that we had worked together with patients, and indeed in some specific cases by showing them the results of some ethnographic studies has helped them a lot to better understand. So it sometimes has even helped with us. I know it's not the general case, but it has made a difference in some cases.
We have time for one last question, and I would like to close with this one for Annabel. We have already touched this point during the discussion. Is it possible to set up a patient advisory board other than in other phases other than clinical research?
Wow, we use them for any purpose, and nowadays we are using them for since, as I said, co-creation of the patient support program as an example. That's a classic. We tend to receive a petition from sponsors who wanted to support the patients on what they believe are the needs of the patient, without asking the patient what type of support do they require. That is not an option, right? So we use them also in market access for us to either co-create an early access program. We use them for us to understand better the patient journey of very difficult oncology types, where understanding if they would access to an early access program would be the case.
Yeah, it's very transversal. You can use it at all stages and for really any purposes. We are out of time. I would like to thank you again both for the very interesting discussion, and all of you for joining us today in this discussion. You will receive a link by email with the recording, and please feel free to share in the survey that will appear right after we close the call your feedback about today's session. Thank you very much, and have a nice rest of the day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Thank you.